And I am done. So I just finished up reading Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb. This is the fourth and final book of the Rain Wild Chronicles sub-series of the main series, Realm of the Elderlings. I loved this book. This is an easy 5 out of 5 stars for me, and I am shocked at how much I love this book because of how much of a rocky start that this series brought me on. If you're not, let me back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about this series and about where we've been up until this point. So, Realm of the Elderlings is this main series of books. It is, I believe, 16 books long, and it's split up into 5 different sub-series. Each 3 books long, except for this one, which is 4 books long. And, you know, the second series of books here is called Live Ship Traders. And it's very different from the first, third, and fifth. I think different than the fifth. I haven't read it yet, but very different than the first and the third series. The second series, though, is called Live Ship Traders, and that was a book series essentially about these ships that are, they have like souls in them. And I don't want to ruin the twist about what these souls are, but these ships are essentially alive. And throughout the books, they have these serpents that are flowing underwater. And by this series, in the Rain Wild Chronicles, it takes up right where that series ended. So I don't watch this interview if you haven't, don't watch this review if you haven't read up until this point, because I have to ruin some of the things that happened until we got here. But I won't spoil anything that happened in this book. So in the Rain Wild Chronicles, though, it picks up where that one left off, and these serpents have just are turning into dragons, and they have gone and like cocooned, and they've like metamorphosized into these dragons. But for a lot of different reasons, these are not like fully fledged dragons. They are very weak, malformed, and it's not looking very good for them. And so that's where we essentially start in this series with these newborn dragons. And you quickly find out that these dragons are causing a major burden on society, and society wants them gone. But they don't want to upset their mother dragon, who's very much alive and can wreak havoc on people. And so they find a way to make the dragons leave, to go try to find this mythical city that they believe exists way far away, and that nobody really thinks actually exists. To help the dragons along the way, they take a group of like outcast children, and some adults like of hunters that can help them survive. And that's an excuse to get them out of their society as well. And they're their keepers. So in the first book, there's a lot of setup. In the second book, which I hated, I gave it 1.5 stars. It's only about the dragons going from like moving up this river the entire book. And it ends with them finally getting to this mythical city. In the third book in the series, which I quite liked, I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's them starting to build the society, and it starts bringing in other point of views from characters that you learned about in the first book and that are a very welcomed change. And in this book, it all finally comes home. You have all these different plot lines that finally converge into a wonderful, wonderful conclusion. You have this major antagonist of this series who's like just the definition of a bad guy. He's this king of another country, and he is dying, and he believes that if he can consume dragon parts, like drink their blood and like grind up their bones into like a powder, that he will live. And so he's like this evil man who will take people take people's children as hostages and say, you don't get your children back until you give me these dragon parts. And so they are on a mad rush to chase these dragons and get them. And so in this book, you have these major events coming together. You have the wrap up of what happens to this really evil guy who has taken a main character, imprisoned him earlier in the book series, and you find out what happens there. You have these dragons that have turned, in a very reasonable way, have turned from these malformed weaklings to fully fledged dragons that can fly and spit acid and are just like magnificent. You have a plot line of a woman who has essentially been in this horrific relationship with a man that she doesn't want to be with, but society is kind of forcing her to be with him. And she abandons him in the first book, and they finally get reunited, and you see what happens there. You have a lot of like interesting twists that happen in the city. You're uncovering this magical world that you get to discover as the reader along with the main characters of this book. It feels so real. I thoroughly love the way this all wrapped up, and I'm just shocked because of how much I hated book 2. Even though book 3 was promising, I heard, when I go to Goodreads and I read about this book, I heard a lot of negative things. I didn't see a 5-star review until it was like 10 reviews down. So hopefully mine gets a little bit of traction and people can see how good this book series is, because it's very well worth it. I love the developments of watching these dragons and thinking back, not just from these 4 books, but thinking about the 7 books, that second series into now, where you had these serpents that, were just randomly talked about, to see where that journey and the progress that they've made to become what they are. It's really, I haven't read a book that feels as impactful on the growth of these mythical beasts like I've read here. And it's really fun to read. I criticized, if you watched my last video, I will pop up a little thing up here that you can click on to watch that review. But in the last series, I criticized that there's these epigraphs, and epigraphs are like a little quote or a little paragraph of text that goes before a chapter. Brandon Sanderson does a lot of this in his Stormlight Chronicle series, and they existed here, and all of them tell this story about messenger birds that are going between these different cities, and it gets really boring. But in this book, they'd actually, like, things get kind of intense, so you have this like other story going on, little bits and pieces, albeit, but it's actually fun, and you get invested, and I actually got excited every time that I ended a chapter, because I got to read and continue this little story that was got me really hooked. So I loved pretty much everything about this book, and I had mentioned in previous reviews that you might want to just skip this series. You might want to say, I'm going to read a recap of it and move on to the final series in the realm of the Elderlings, which I've heard is some of the best books that have ever been written by Robin Hobb, and I'm really excited to read them. I do not recommend skipping these books. In fact, I like the second book, the one that I've criticized so heavily. I like it a lot more now that I can look back on it and see what it was bringing me towards. It was a slog, but it developed these characters in an important way that I think was very needed to be able to tell the story like it was. Now, there was a part of this book that I did not enjoy. Luckily, it was not a major part, and I won't ruin anything, but there's a love triangle that just bores the heck out of me, and it feels so baseline. They're trying to tell this like story about how a woman can choose a man for herself, and it just feels like it's been, all of us know this. It's not a lesson that we need to be told, and it's trying to be deeper than it actually was, and it felt just kind of like a YA romance that it wasn't as good as a lot of YA romance kind of stuff. It was weak, but it's not a lot of pages in this book take up that, so I can totally forgive it. So I just think back to this whole series as a whole and how amazing this journey has been. And I thoroughly recommend you read this series and give it a shot. And read the whole realm of the Elderlings. Read it from start to finish. They're some of the best books that I've ever read, and I'm really looking forward to finishing this out with the final 3 books. And I have not been spoiled one iota. I have no idea what they're about. That's how I like to go into my books, and I'm really excited. So I should be starting to read that series in June. I probably won't finish it in June. I read a lot of different book series at the same time. I take a lot of big breaks in between each book. So I'll probably be all the way done in July, and then I'll probably do a big recap of the realm of the Elderlings as a whole. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you pick up this book.